Et ensuite, nous passerons à notre discussion. Et je souhaiterais la bienvenue à mon collègue. Donc, nous avons continué sur les discussions que nous avons eues sur les conférences pour les conventions. Et cette session va traiter à plus sur la signification de l'intégration des communautés dans les ressources forestières et la justification des instructions sur l'AND. Les participations de Kenya à Madagascar pour trouver des solutions pratiques vont former la discussion pour nous mettre de travailler sur la conservation, le changement climatique, la dégradation des terres et les droits aux droits fonciers des différentes communautés. Nous travaillerons. La session devra nous donner des points de vue pratiques et pour appuyer les trois conventions environnementales que nous avons travaillé pour le bien des gens de la planète et de l'Afrique. Nous allons travailler également sur les questions des investissements. Nous espérons avoir une session qui pourra discuter ces différents.
Indigenous population. These actions should support livelihood and should not diminish the productive capacity or cultural values of the land. So, however, screening a little bit on LDN, target setting document, and the different policies that they formulated, we just realized that they are somehow heavily oriented on forest protection and the promotion on various types of plantation. I mean, we can understand the reasoning behind. Most of the countries also signed the Convention on Biodiversity Protection, on climate. So we can understand the crucial role of forest and the decision to conserve all those natural resources. But in a context of increasing demand for food, water, and energy, as well as the pressure and competition over land, can we sustainably conserve the resources without looking at the adjacent communities, without looking at tenure rights? So it's really understandable that UNCCD parties and all the international communities push for the decision 26 COP14, and a landmark decision that notes the importance of addressing land tenure in the context of LDN. So how this decision is implemented, how at national level land tenure is taken into consideration in different policies is something that is really important to analyze, to observe, and that is the reason TMG, through the Global Soil Review Project, initiated a pilot research first to analyze and examine how different policy document and framework integrate tenure right in the decisions. The second objective of the project is to explore ways to safeguard access and use of land rights in implementing LDN, together with the partners to co-develop approach to integrate and monitor land tenure in LDN implementation. And of course, given our position, we are always trying to build and to connect local to the international processes, hence the evidence-based advocacy at global level, as we did during UNCCD COP15 in Abidjan. So here is the participatory mapping that we follow. I will not burden you with all the detail. Just keep in mind that it has been really like a process that starts with a situation analysis in some targeted area. Then we mobilize the communities, we engage with them to define priorities and to analyze the different perspective on tenure. Then we start with the mapping preparation, and then we proceed with the mapping itself using Survey 123 and the Cadastre platform. And at the end, all the maps that we obtained and all the results of the survey have been shared again with the communities and various level decision makers to validate the result and the maps. So what have been the key findings of our research across the 4 countries? First is we observe a lack of safeguard. Yes, we have a lot of planning and conservation instruments, but the implementation on the ground is somehow limited and do not provide effective safeguard against infringement. Second findings, risk for legitimate tenure right holders. In all 4 countries, dependent communities hold tenure right for extended period of time, sometimes over 13 years, 30 years, but still they feel insecure on the land because the land are not recognized and they are always considered as simple users, while in fact, in positive example, we can think of adjacent communities as partners and decision makers. There is also a limited awareness of and participation, especially when you are talking about the municipalities, that is the entity in charge of implementing all the development policies, including the policies formulated to achieve LDN targets. So it's a bit striking that the municipalities are sometimes not aware of the country's commitment and are even not associated in the formulated of policy measures, yet when in the implementation on policies, some issues emerge, they are supposed to be the one who will manage the issues. So a critical example is a situation that right now in Benin, where some communities have been forcibly displaced from a forest without any plan to relocate them, and the municipalities are still trying to solve this issue because you have some conflicts always. So another finding that is power dynamics and non-participatory management mechanisms induce latent conflict that undermine effort to reconcile conservation goals with communities' legitimate right to land and resources. So for example, this map you are seeing here is just a small part of the Three River gazetted forest. The part in yellow is the so-called delineated agricultural land, and then in green you have the protection zone. So you can see that farmers are cultivating slowly and going beyond the agricultural land, while a lot of discussion and debate can be done on the hows and whys. It's really important to understand that without participatory mechanism, even top-down approach to limit communities in this kind of limited spot will not work, and it effort to conserve the forest will have limited impact if adjacent communities' right to land and resources are not recognized and protected. So it's really important that communities be part of all management plan and be treated as partners with some rights well recognized for them to invest in sustainable land management, to invest in agroforestry, and to contribute to the conservation of the forest that we really want to preserve. So, but we cannot preserve our resources sustainably if we don't set the conditions for adjacent communities and all other stakeholders to sustain their livelihood and to participate to the management of the forest. So what are our key message? Landscape. Communities living adjacent to forest, rangeland, and other ecosystems are critical to achieving national and global restoration targets and must be meaningfully involved in the design and implementation. For them to become stewards and beneficiaries of sustainable land management, they need support in claiming their rights and securing access to forest and land resources. Now, moving from landscape to rights, UNCCD Land Tenure Decision 26 COP14 and Decision 12 COP15 address a critical gap between LDN and responsible land governance and should be more targeted by national government and other Rio conventions. We need to invest resources and commit to implement those decisions and put the necessary conditions for actors on the ground to be in the position to implement and to integrate and monitor those decisions in their daily activities. From right to investment is a bit of lure if we can plan activities without thinking of resources. So before any investment in LDN and other restoration targets are undertaken, it is vital to document the land tenure right of those people who live in the area in which such investment will be made. So in the context where some governments, some are complaining on limited resources, it's really important that smallholder farmers who occupy over 48% of lands over the globe, the world, and contribute to over 80% of food in Africa and Asia, be responsible, be in the condition where they can invest themselves on sustainable land management without waiting for external people to come and put in place some mechanism and incentive. That being said, it's not to undermine the contribution of international agencies and investment in LDN. This is very much needed, and I'm sure that some people who are well in the position to talk about the challenge of investment will talk about this in a while. Our landscape, our right, our investments. Like I said, it requires long-term investment to sustainably align the legitimate land tenure right with conservation and restoration needs. I want to finish by sending my gratitude to all our partners who contribute to our research, are still contributing to our research in the 4 countries. I want to name APIC NGO, I want to name Kenvo, I want to name TLC, I want to name LendDev, and I want to also name the Kenyan Forest Services, and of course the partner government in Kenya, in Benin, in Malawi, and in Madagascar. Thanks again for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Kader, for that presentation and for highlighting the disconnect between the national level and the local level. We'll now go into our panel discussion, and for that, I'll begin by quickly adding to what you've just presented. The second edition of the UNCCD's publication, The Global Land Outlook, states that land degradation neutrality is at the center of land restoration agenda. The publication goes further to list putting people at the front and center and safeguarding land rights among the key actions that can ensure sustainability in our efforts to achieve land degradation neutrality. So when we consider LDN at the national level, LDN programs are developed by working groups coordinated by environment ministries, and most of these programs propose actions to be undertaken on forest areas, just as Kader has presented. From what my colleague Kader has presented, the existing frameworks provide for co-management of lands and forests where LDN measures are being implemented, and this can be considered a first step in recognizing legitimate tenure rights. However, implementing these provisions is dependent on a number of factors, including the capacity of the respective government agencies and of local communities. Evidently, these programs have prioritized achievement of targets set to reduce and reverse land degradation, but smallholder farmers are seemingly not yet at the front and center of these efforts. So my first question to our first panelist, Dr. Susan Chomba, is, in the face of increasing drought and climate impacts in Africa, what are some of the opportunities and challenges of engaging smallholder farmers in LDN programs and land restoration in general? Dr. Susan, welcome. Yeah, please do. I will assume that you have your video already on.
Yes, I don't have control from my side, but let me just perhaps thanks Kader very much for that fantastic presentation. And I want first to reflect on that presentation and perhaps just 2 key things that struck me in the presentation. First of all, is the idea of where the LDN targets mainly focus. So I was listening very keenly. And I saw that the LDN targets seem to focus mainly the forest protection as well as areas that are considered as plantations. To me, this already signifies a challenge, because where are the agricultural lands, and why shouldn't we be worried about land degradation in agricultural lands? So it makes me arrive to at least one conclusion, that we have a false dichotomy here of how we can be able to achieve land degradation neutrality. Because as Kader very well mentioned and gave the example of Benin, when farmers cultivate areas, and these particular areas that are agricultural lands, the soil becomes exhausted, soil nutrients become exhausted. In order for them to continue increasing their productivity, finding other fertile lands, we've seen cases, and especially in places like the Central Africa region, where we still have a lot of primary forests, then the natural way is then to extend into natural forests, into other ecosystems, to be able to get areas where the soil is still fertile. So if we do want a land degradation neutrality that is truly neutral, we do want to address the soil fertility, both in agricultural land, so that we can be able to achieve degradation neutrality as well in the forest and protected areas. So for me, that struck me as a false dichotomy of focusing the land degradation neutrality mainly in forest areas and in plantations. And we have to think of land as an ecosystem as a whole, so that we can be able to get the land degradation neutrality from all land categories. The second thing that really struck me was about, and for us who've been working in the forestry sector, in forest governance, in forest management, in community engagement, in forest management, this is not news. But what is, I think, a bit disturbing is that we are seeing persistent in terms of, for every convention that we set up, we forget that the rights of local communities is extremely important. And not just rights, but also their participation and their decision-making in most of the work that we are doing, whether it's on the land degradation neutrality, whether it's on climate change mitigation and adaptation, or biodiversity. Those three Rio conventions need to really put communities and indigenous people at the center of their decision-making. So when I was listening to Kader, again, I just had a reflection that there are many scientific articles that show who owns the world's forests. Most of the world forests are actually owned by central governments. At least almost 90% of them, of forests, are owned by central governments. And only about 10% is owned by communities and individuals. What does that mean? It means that most of the forests that we are trying to protect, communities don't have access rights, they don't have ownership rights, they don't feel the right to be able to protect those forests. And then what we've seen is, where we have very limited rights for local communities, is that it's very difficult for those central governments to come and protect the forest without engagement of local communities. And so what we are seeing in a lot of studies that have been conducted in areas like the Congo Basin, in Eastern Africa, in Tanzania, the more you decentralize ownership and management of forests, the more you're likely to have sustainable forest management. The more communities are going to engage in activities that are going to likely to protect those forests, they can have rights to use the forest, and therefore they will help in managing and protecting the forest. So it doesn't work. It's counterintuitive to think that we have a central, if we have strong protection, if we have forest agencies that are strong command and control, that we are going to get our forest protected. But on the contrary, we've seen it's the exact opposite. So with that reflection, then I come to your question, Washe, on why is it then, why is it that we are seeing less engagement, less participation of local communities in a lot of initiatives, even the LDN targets, and even the restoration process that I'm currently deeply engaged in? I think there are three hypotheses. As I said, mainly first, remembering that we are coming from a history of where governments own a majority of forests, that the tendency is to impose command and control structures. The tendency is to have strong forest agencies that are supposed to protect forests, even though history has shown us that those systems are completely ineffective in managing forests. Secondly, we have to acknowledge that there has been some progress on involvement of communities in forest management. For instance, you mentioned in Kenya where we have Community Forest Association, but that is not matched by capacity, that is not matched by empowerment of local communities to then be able to engage sufficiently when it comes to negotiating for rights. So it's not like the forests have been completely decentralized, where there are provisions that communities can be able to negotiate with forest agencies to be able to protect different forests. But without proper empowerment of those communities, without support in terms of decision-making, it becomes very difficult because you have different power balances between historically strong state agencies and communities who've not historically been very much empowered to make decisions and empowered to negotiate for rights to manage those forests. So I think last but not least, I'd like to mention, of course, communities are not homogeneous, and that even though we are seeing greater, roles in delegation of forest management roles to communities, we are seeing huge disparities in terms of different members of communities, especially when you talk about indigenous people, when you talk about women, when you talk about youth. We have to recognize that they are not, communities are not homogeneous, and that even within communities, there are different power dynamics. And somehow you look at the history of community engagement, and most of the times you might see a lot of areas where we have elites in communities getting more ability to negotiate and to benefit from forests than marginalized and disempowered community groups. So let me pause there, but I think those are kind of the reflections I'd like to bring to the table, and look forward to hearing what other panelists also managed to get from the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Susan, for that contribution. You mentioned a number of things. I'll just quickly highlight the false dichotomy of focusing LDN on forest areas, and they need to include all land categories, and that the success of landscape and forest restoration will benefit from community involvement. And you also spoke of rights, and I will just use that to segue into the next question. For the rights aspect of this discussion, earlier last month, Sierra Leone passed the Customary Lands Rights Act. This new law provides for establishment of local land use committees to make decisions on how community lands are managed. The law also mandates that 30% of members of the land use committees should be women. And according to media reports, this law will help boost the rights of rural landowners and of women. So my question to our second panelist, Songkita Conte, is, drawing on Sierra Leone's recent landmark community land rights legislation, what are some of the enabling conditions that can help reconcile landscape restoration with the livelihood needs of dependent communities? Songkita, welcome.
Thank you very much, Washi, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel with everyone. Kader, thanks for the presentation. So as Washi mentioned, last month was pivotal for Sierra Leone. Two critical land laws were passed by our parliament. But then that is just the beginning of hopefully a new process that will see a turnaround in how we manage land in Sierra Leone. But the fact is, for decades, large-scale land-based investments in Sierra Leone have had a zero-sum impact on our land rights and on the rights of communities. These investments have trampled on the land rights of communities and destroyed critical ecosystems. If you look across the country, you would find communities that have lost access to their ancestral lands to either mining or plantation agriculture. And these communities have also witnessed the destruction of their forests, the pollution of their rivers, and the loss of livelihoods. However, as Washi mentioned, this looks set to change with the passage of the Customary Land Rights Act sometime last month. Now, this law essentially seeks to restore the harmony that has not existed between rights and environment on one hand and land-based investment on the other. I'll just quickly talk through some of the things that it provides, and then we'll see why we're very hopeful in Sierra Leone that we're entering into a new era. So one of the first things it does is to ensure that customary tenure rights are documented, they're now formalized. for the last several hundred years, customary land rights have not benefited from formal recognition and or documentation. And so it's been difficult to get communities to show any title to their land. And it makes it easier to displace them or to take the land rights from them. So the law is addressing that. The second thing it does is it mandates free, prior, and informed consent by communities for all forms of investments, whether it's a traditional mining or large-scale agriculture, whether it's it's landscape restoration. All forms of investments now require free, prior, and informed consent of communities. And this is huge because in the past, especially in relation to mining, we've not had that situation. The government would take decisions at the central level and essentially impose those decisions on communities. So companies will simply show up in communities and say, oh, by the way, we obtained a license from the government to mine, and we're going to do it. And this is what we would pay you for accessing your land and destroying your land. Now, the other thing that the law does is it prohibits investment in ecologically sensitive areas. In the past, we've seen companies going into rainforest areas or into wetlands and destroying these very critical ecosystems because they want to mine or undertake agriculture. So the law is prohibiting any investment in old growth forests, steep slopes, and wildlife habitats. Now, in addition to that, companies are required to provide complete information on the investments, including their business plans, agreements that they've signed with the government, or agreements with other investors to communities before embarking on negotiations with communities. So basically what it requires is that people should know exactly what they're entering into before they enter into those transactions. Another critical provision that is in the law is with respect to environmental protection. Now, in the past, we've seen environmental protection as the sole purview of the government agencies that are created to regulate the environment, such as the Environment Protection Agency. What this law does is it involves communities now in the protection of the environment by incorporating automatically all environmental license conditions into lease agreements between communities and investors. So very clearly, what it means now is that if a company misbehaves, if the company destroys ecosystems, it pollutes rivers or destroys swamplands, communities can take direct action against those corporations. Now, in addition to that, the law also does something around livelihoods. One is it eliminates the artificial value that government has hitherto put on land. Previously, government has valued land below its actual economic value. In our case, the government had set up a ceiling of $5 per acre as the amount that companies should pay for rent per annum. Now that is completely artificial, and it does not speak to the value of the land, and it means that communities don't always get the full benefit of their natural resources of their land when companies acquire them. And to make matters worse, these communities only got 50% of the value of the land of this $5. The rest is shared among local politicians and government, different government bodies. So that has changed now, and the law mandates that everything goes to communities. First off, there is no artificial value. Communities can negotiate for what they want for their land, and the full amount of what they negotiate goes to them. And this is big because it will enhance alternatives for communities. If they're giving up their land, then they should be able to get some financial benefits for that. And I'll talk about two more things that the law does. It now provides for co-ownership of investment by communities. So the law sets out that at least 10% of shares in companies that invest in land in the provinces, in the rural areas, should be reserved for communities and citizens of Sierra Leone, but with particular preference for communities where the investment is happening. So what this does is it does not look at investment as something that is alien coming from the outside. it looks at investment as a joint endeavor where communities not only give up land, but they're also co-owners of the investment, and it provides a means of sustaining the investment going forward. Now, I'll say one thing, though, that what is needed in the present context is political will to fully implement these provisions. So whether it's landscape restoration, whether it's traditional investment, if we have the political will in Sierra Leone to implement this particular law, then I think we will truly exemplify the theme of today's meeting, which is our landscape, our rights, our investment, because what it does now is redress the imbalance that used to exist in these interactions between the environment and the rights of communities and investment. But if this law is fully implemented, I think we are on a path to really seeing a balance in how these three things interrelate. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonkita, for that contribution and for the main issues you mentioned, the need for formal recognition and documentation of community land rights, and also the need for political goodwill so that all these policy changes actually have an impact. Now, I'll move on to the third aspect of our discussion, which Sonkita already touched on, which is the aspect of investment. Our third panelist, Manitrala, is an expert in sustainable forest management, landscape and forest restoration, and forest socioeconomics. Manitrala has vast experience in integrated landscape management and biodiversity conservation in various agroecological zones in Madagascar. My question to you, Manitrala, is building on your experience and on the discussion we've had so far, what changes and reforms do you consider necessary to build financing systems that are adapted to local needs and contexts while contributing to agreed global targets? And I believe, Manitrala, you'll be contributing in French, so for those who don't understand French, please use the interpretation function to get it in English. Welcome, Manitrala.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Haché.
Thank you very much, Haché. Hello, everyone. I come from Madagascar. My name is Manitrala, so I'm going to talk to you about my experience based, of course, on previous presentations by my colleagues, by our panelists, to see the restoration of lands and to deal with drafts for Madagascar, and I think for Africa in general. Our colleague has told us about documentation that we need to have before any and all investment. I must confirm that this is applicable because if the activity is not accepted by the population, or if this activity is not owned by the population, the investment will be a catastrophe. For example, in Madagascar, if we add up all these activities that have been performed in the last 10 years, well, our country, we have had plantations even near seashores. So this is why we've had negative consequences. Why? Because this activity has not respected the rights of ownership. So we need to protect them and also to change the mindsets, because we need to formalize in the areas where this is happening. So my next recommendation about this reform is the change of paradigm on a climate economy. What kind of changes should we know about? Well, we need to take into consideration degradation. We are attempting at preserving everything that's left, which is a good activity. But I will need to insist, on top of this, we need mostly to solve the fundamental causes of degradation. When we talk about that is, well, we need to satisfy the needs of the people. We need to make sure that these needs are satisfied for the population utilizing the lands and also the needs of the consumers, the population that consume. So we need to have a balance in terms of the funding that is being attributed for natural resource valuable sustainable investment, and also to promote all the technologies that will provide better yields so that we can also make sure resources are preserved and lands are restored. Also, forests being restored and to overall ameliorate all the local population livelihoods. The next suggestion that I have is to raise awareness and to empower investment so that we can have more users being financially empowered, but also knowingly. So we need to reinforce all the capacities and mostly accompanying all the stakeholders. So all of this has been applied in our project for land restoration, but then again, what I must insist on is we need to have accompaniment that will be provided to beneficiaries. Why? Because in Madagascar, 90% of producers are small-scale farmers. When we talk about small-scale farmers, well, there is very little education. Only half of them has reached the primary level in terms of education. Africa's conditions overall is similar, so we need to accompany them and adapt this accompaniment to the education levels. The next suggestion that I was advancing on as well was invest on security. When we talk about security, well, our previous colleagues who have intervened, well, they have already talked about land ownership. And this is basically the problem that lies in investment, and which will could also be a solution so that all investments on a landscape restoration could succeed if we respect the legal framework on projects on those areas where investment is being put in place. Well, we will be sure that sustainability in activities will be ensured. And also, we need to secure investment versus natural disasters or anthropic disasters. So the investors have considered insurance policies versus the loss of yield and also climate change, because there are people with limited resources and revenue. And so we need to make sure that there is structural and sound institutions and also our organizational soundness for beneficial countries. So investments need to withstand the structural changes of government systems within countries on the one hand, and also on the other hand, we need to have political decision makers avoiding minimizing to the extent of what's possible the structural and organizational changes in those countries, which could potentially have a negative impact on investment continuity and also the durability. And a last point that I would like to tell you about just as I wrap up my intervention is investment inclusion that will favor vulnerable populations. When we talk about vulnerable populations, well, we have the layer of women that's always neglected in terms of land ownership and land rights, especially when it comes to education, capacity development, reinforcement. So if vulnerable populations, in this case women, could be empowered, well, their livelihoods will be better, and also investment will be more durable and will be insured. So I will wrap up my part by saying thank you to all the investors that have intervened in Madagascar in Africa. And so I must insist to reinforce and consider my suggestions of investments could be insured in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manitrala, for that contribution. And I think the key issues I picked up in your response were the need to raise awareness to change mindsets, to reinforce capacity and involve all stakeholders, and to provide incentives for smallholder farmers to get on board this agenda. And unfortunately, we've eaten so much into our time, and I fear we may not have our open panel discussion, but I'll just move on to the next section where we had dedicated for a response from one of our country partners. I'll now call upon one of our country partners to respond to the issues that we presented so far. And specifically, I'll call upon Alidou Takpara, the Executive Director of APIC NGO, to give us an initial response on other issues we need to consider at the national and subnational level when it comes to ensuring smallholder farmers are at the front and center of land restoration efforts. Mr. Alidou Takpara, please feel free to join and respond.
Oui, merci bien. Bonjour.
Thank you. Good morning.
Bonjour, Alidou, and please switch on your video.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
On vous entend.
Can you hear me? Yes, I can hear you. You can move on with your talk. Thank you very much for hosting this event. This event is highly important as we share the knowledge that we have. So in Benin, the works that we have been doing and which Kader had already talked to us about, well, it's capital, and it's a matter that we need to keep on talking about, the sustainable care of forests and our lands, which cannot be done without the help of our communities. So communities are experiencing drafts more and more, and we have never felt comfortable in terms of safety in order for us to invest in the GDT, what we call in French, in order to follow these efforts in the long run. So there have been many setbacks in those investments that we have been talking about. Likewise, we cannot pressure them, because if we do pressure upon them, the activities will not be led to becoming sustainable in communities. Why? Because what they are doing is just making do with what they have and thinking just about the present and not taking care about the future. So in this way, populations that have been there for decades need to be feeling clear as to the fact that everybody will be there to stay, both them, their children and grandchildren. So by having that certainty, they will be able to invest in the long run and in a manner that is sustainable. So we need to arrive at institutional agreements in the community level with the governments and the forest agencies which are responsible for preservation. Because if we are trying to impose rules which are not taking care of community livelihoods, well, these laws will be doing nothing but harden themselves, and the communities and the states won't have a zero-sum game, and so the environment will be the ultimate victim. I don't know if I'm making myself clear or if I took too much time. Thank you very much, Kader. I think the time was all right.
Yeah, thank you, Alidu. The timing was perfect. You took exactly 5 minutes, and of course, I appreciate that. I will just highlight something you mentioned, which has been mentioned by I think all speakers. They need to keep on having these conversations about conserving our forests and land, which cannot be done without the involvement of our communities. I think that's something important, and it has been highlighted a number of times and speaks to the theme of this event we are having today. And with that out of the way, we have 7 minutes to go, and I want to apologize to our audience because it has eaten through the time we would have had for another round of discussions from our panelists. But at this point, I'd like to call my very good colleague and the head of programs at TMG Research, Jess Weigelt, to give us some final feedback and final takeaways from what we've discussed today. Yes, please, welcome.
Good morning, Washer, and thank you very much for giving me the floor and actually for hosting this very, very interesting session. And thanks to all the panelists for their really, really nice and interesting contributions. They were really to the point, and I really hope that you apologize the initial difficulties that we had with the translation and on the platform. So I apologize for that, and I would really like to thank the great panelists for their contributions. I'd like to speak about 5 points that I noted down. I would like to situate the discussion that we had in the context of the general debate on climate justice. I would like to situate the UNCCD land tenure decision in that context. I will speak about the interplay that has been mentioned several times now by our panelists between communities and the state. And I will conclude by giving a brief outlook towards UNFCCC COP27 in Egypt later this year. The whole discussion on climate justice often focuses rightly on the question of historic emissions, and now increasingly the question of loss and damage and how to account for the losses that are incurred by dramatic impact of climate change, in particular in those countries who have contributed the least to climate change. What this session today has emphasized is another very important aspect of the discussion on climate justice, which is the distributional aspect attached to what is now being heralded as net zero policies. Net zero policies demand an increasing investment in afforestation and ecosystem restoration. And what the panelists have aptly underscored today is that there will not be a just transition neither to land degradation neutrality, nor to climate net zero policies, or to biodiversity conservation, if we do not manage to recognize the legitimate land tenure rights of the communities who are actually the stewards of the land. And I think this is a very strong message that emerges from this session, and I would like to emphasize that. In this context, coming to my second point, the decision by parties to the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification to actually situate the principles of responsible land governance as they have been agreed upon unanimously by the members of the UN Committee on World Food Security and enshrined in the voluntary guidelines on responsible land governance, by the parties to really recognize the VGTs and make them part of a decision of the Convention to Combat Desertification, is a huge step to reconcile the question of legitimate tenure rights and restoration. And I think it's sort of the decision, therefore, is what we would say a hallmark decision on the avenue to address, actually, to move towards the just transitions question that I mentioned before. Now, coming to my third point, how to actually implement this. And I think our panelists have been very clear on outlining many of those elements. And I will not repeat this in detail, but I would like to say that it really depends on the interplay between what it is that communities can do and must do, and what it is that the state needs to do to create an enabling environment so that they actually empowered to do so. And I think, Susan, I would like to pick on your point on the empowerment question. Somebody has written, if you remove the term power from empowerment, you are left with very little. And I think the whole question that also Kader has spoken about in his introductory presentation, the decentralization of forest management and the empowerment and capacity building of forest user communities is absolutely essential in this regard. And as Sokita has mentioned, this obviously requires that community rights to land are recognized at the national level. This cannot be done by communities alone. The recognition of community land rights need to be done by cities, by cities, stupid, by the state. But it really, then within these, once the areas are demarcated, it really requires the empowered communities to take on the role of management. And I think there is often a reluctance within restoration programs to proactively address land tenure issues because they are considered to be political and difficult and cumbersome. But I think what the presentations today have shown is that if those rights are not being proactively addressed, restoration runs the serious risk of violating rights and violating human rights in the process. So there is an important safeguarding element to recognizing legitimate tenure rights. And second, and maybe even most importantly, if we do not manage to recognize those rights, we miss out on creating incentives for the communities to actually invest in restoration. And I think this enabling function and the safeguarding function of securing legitimate land tenure rights is absolutely essential. And last but not least, as we are really running out of time, I think what we would want to conclude with is that the discussion on legitimate tenure rights, although we started the work in the context of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, is actually a cross-cutting topic across the convention. So it applies to the discussion on biodiversity as the negotiations on the Global Biodiversity Framework show, and it applies to discussion within the climate debate. So we hope that the excellent presentations of today will actually contribute to a very engaged discussion on that topic in the huge events that are coming and following later on this year. Thank you very much. I apologize for speaking so long. Washer, I hand back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Yes, for the final remarks and for closing for us. I'll just do a quick closing. I'll take less than 2 minutes or less than 1 minute. In closing, first, I wish to thank everyone who joined us today for this session, and to the panelists who've given us very informative contributions to the topic of the day. I think we have a lot to think about beyond this session. I also want to thank our country partners and the communities who were instrumental in us undertaking this research. Everyone involved was very important to us, getting us to these findings and being able to share this information at these sessions. I will also want to acknowledge our interactive audience who sent us questions in the chat, and I apologize that we ran out of time today because we couldn't answer these questions, but please feel free to reach out to us and we can always give the feedback beyond this session. And finally, it's just 1 minute past the hour we had dedicated to this session. So I want to wish you all a very good rest of the day. And thank you once again for joining us today. Have a good day.